Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise here this afternoon, like my colleagues on this side of the aisle, with a very heavy heart. When we look at the revenue stream, when we see the sources that our revenues have increasing by, it is extremely a sad day for us here in Connecticut. We are hoping and praying, Mr. Speaker, that through smoking, drinking, and gambling, I repeat that once again, we are praying here that smoking, drinking, and gambling, we will get our state out of fiscal trouble. Is that the direction for our state to go? Is that the revenue stream that we will depend on so we can get ourselves out of this hole? Definitely a sad day when we depend on these various components by which we raise our revenue stream. Through you, Mr. Speaker, if I could ask a few questions to the chair of the Finance Committee.
Please proceed, sir.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I know a lot of these line items have been talked about.
Excuse me, sir. Representative Berger, there's a question that's coming to you from Representative Srinivasan, if you could prepare yourself. Please proceed, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, to the good chair of the Finance Committee. My colleagues have talked about this, but I'm still not clear, in spite of the conversation we have had, on lines T3 and T4, where the income, the personal income is declined significantly, and yet we expect on line T4 that the sales, the taxes generated from sales will increase. To me, it does not make sense at all. Then the income is down, but our sales are up. The revenues from this. Through you, Mr. Speaker, maybe the good chair can explain as to how, when the personal income has dropped significantly, and we've heard this, that there's a good, the 50 top wage earners in our state are no longer the same, and that's why the shift in personal income. When that income has dropped, through you, Mr. Speaker, the revenue gain for sales and use in line T4. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important for the representative and certainly for everyone in the chamber to understand that you need to really bifurcate those two numbers. On the personal, and I will explain the reasoning why. On the personal income side, that is directly related, obviously, to income that is associated and taxable in the state of Connecticut at various income levels. Now, the good representative is correct. When we look at the top, and we just use the top 50 in calculating a figure, you could certainly go to the top 100 earners. But certainly there was an erosion of personal income that's related to both withholding and that's related to quarterly dividends, capital gains. There was an erosion of approximately $3 billion out of the 50 top earners, which would have a direct result on personal income revenue side of over $200 million. So we do see an erosion of high income earners, and they represent a very, very great portion of where we get our income from. So that's related, directly related to that scenario. On the sales and use tax, we see consumption, and that is the consumer spending more, having more discretionary income to be able to make a purchase, be it of a car, of a truck, a recreational vehicle, buying things at the store. So we do see a direct correlation from separate from high income earners on the purchases, thereby creating a sales and use tax uptick based on a 6.35% occurrence. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, our sales tax rate has not changed, has it? Are we still at 6.35? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, when the sales tax rate has not changed and we are still at 6.35, I know the good chairman is trying to explain to us this revenue gain from sales and use. But through you, Mr. Speaker, do we have an idea as to where this major source of revenue is from sales, or I know it's an estimate, I'm well aware of that, but in the estimates, do we have some categories where we feel that these revenue sources, these estimates would really pan out for us? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, and they certainly have panned out. We are seeing a gradual uptick based on our projected numbers on sales and use, and that covers the gamut of any, through you, Mr. Speaker, any item that's purchased or sold that would be subject to the 6.35%. Certainly, the retail area is an area that we see an uptick, consumer purchases in the retail area, and we do see in the area of motor vehicle purchases and/or truck, recreational vehicles, those being some examples, through you, Mr. Speaker, of where there's been an increased amount of revenue gain through our 6.35 tax. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the good chair for his answers. Through you, Mr. Speaker, on our luxury tax, through you, Mr. Speaker, have we seen any significant increase as far as revenues are concerned? Not the 6.35, but our luxury tax. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, we have seen an uptick in the 7% tax, and that's what the good representative is referring to. That would be a purchase, say, of a motor vehicle, $50,000 or greater, which would be subject to 7% taxation, not 6.35. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, then T4 includes both the 6.35 as well as the 7% tax. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I didn't catch the last part of it.
Representative Srinivasan, could you repeat your question?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, so line T4 includes the uptick in revenue stream that includes both the sales from the 6.35 tax as well as the 7% tax. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I know there has been discussions on T9, T12, as well as T25, cigarette, drinking, and the gambling component of the revenue stream. Through you, Mr. Speaker, if I heard the good chairman correctly, that this does not include the revenue stream from Keno. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, it does not, the lottery sales are calculated in a different line. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if the good chairman can point out to me as to where that revenue stream is included. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
I believe that question was asked before, but Representative Berger, if you could.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Speaker, the line that deals with special revenues. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for asking the question again. Sometimes the noise in the room is hard to hear what's going on here. Through you, Mr. Speaker, line T36 is a huge concern for me. And through you, Mr. Speaker, the transfer from the tobacco settlement. Through you, Mr. Speaker, are we increasing the transfer from the settlement fund into the general fund? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's correct.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, we all know good public policy. We've worked hard here in the chamber, and we've worked hard in the committee before we come here to make sure we have good public policy as far as the residents of our state are concerned. And through you, Mr. Speaker, when the taxes revenues from cigarettes is on the increase, through you, Mr. Speaker, for us to transfer more funds out of the tobacco settlement account into the general account. Through you, Mr. Speaker, could the good chair tell me as to what is the rationale behind increasing the allocation of the settlement fund into the general fund? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, it's a policy decision based on a $4 million transfer.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if I heard the good chairman correctly, as I said earlier, it's a little difficult to hear in the chamber. Is that a policy decision? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, to expand on that, it's a policy decision based on negotiation, and it's a transfer of an additional $4 million from the settlement fund. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, on an annual basis, how much do we get into the tobacco settlement fund? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yeah. Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe the figure is approximately $108 million.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, if the amount we get from the tobacco settlement fund is 108, so are we transferring the entire amount into the general fund for as our revenue stream? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, if I understand correctly, in this budget that we have, revenue calculated through that, through some of the sweep of that fund is $4 million. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not clear I understood that clearly. So I'll be looking at 108, but what is the total amount that comes into the tobacco settlement fund on an annual basis? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, it's $108 million. That would be the entire amount. This budget also calculates the additional $4 million on the yearly sweep. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So if I hear that correctly, not only are we transferring the entire amount, the 108, and along with that, we are transferring the $4 million as well into the general fund. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is an event that's occurring within this budget that we are currently for this year, 2017.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, could a good chairman tell me and tell us here in the chamber the intent or the purpose of getting these tobacco settlement funds? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if the good representative could restructure that question, I'm not quite sure what he would be asking me. To explain the settlement or the reasoning why the settlement occurred. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan, could you clarify your question, please?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I definitely can. Through you, Mr. Speaker, what I was inquiring of our good chair was the intent, the purpose of receiving the money for a tobacco settlement. Through you, Mr. Speaker, so then I can go to the next question from that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Representative, I'm not sure that Representative Berger was even in the legislature at the time that the settlement was reached, but Representative Berger, do you have a reply?
Well, I could take a stab at it, Mr. Speaker. I certainly, I think the good representative is probably setting up the second question, so I'll help set the table for him here. Probably the original intent of the tobacco settlement funds was to get at smoking cessation, try to help out smokers, maybe smoke less, and probably some of the proprietary proprietary tactics that the industry was involved in. I think that's the answer, and I'll anticipate the next question through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the good chair for his answer and for a good shot that he took at the answer. Because as you know, Mr. Speaker, I too was not here in the chamber when the settlement was made or when these details of this was worked out. But we are well aware of the intent of the settlement fund. And as a good chairman said, the intent of the settlement fund was to look at techniques for cessation of smoking. And I'm very concerned on a public policy that here we are, we have funds allocated to us for the right reason, for what we need to accomplish with that money. And instead of going about doing that, we are transferring 108 million, all of it, 100%, and even sweeping some more funds into the general fund so that in some way or the other, we can try to balance our budget. And when you tie that, Mr. Speaker, of the sweeping of all these funds on the one hand, on line T36, and go back to T9, where the sales, the taxes from the sales of cigarettes are actually increasing, it is no surprise. It is no surprise. We have money for cessation. We are not using that money for the right purpose, for the purpose it was intended for, and we are sweeping it into the general fund to take care of our day-to-day bills, to take care and make sure that the lights are on here in the capital and in the LOB and the rest of the state. But at what cost? At the cost of our kids, at the cost of our grandchildren, because what we are ending up here is getting more taxes, a revenue stream through cigarettes. And so you, Mr. Speaker, I just want to share my thought that when a state like ours is depending, not solely dependent, thank God, but depending on increased revenue stream, not from the right direction, not from the income taxes, not from the growth of industry, not from corporations, getting the revenue source, revenue stream from them. But instead, we are counting, and as I said earlier, praying that it is through smoking, drinking, gambling, keno, whatever you add that becomes the source of our revenue. It is, unfortunately, a very sad state for us here in Connecticut. We need to change that around and make sure that our revenue source comes from where it should come from. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.